June 1985. We were on our way to the park that night. The best one. The one with that narrow corkscrew slide and the endless, moldy rope bridge that Silva and myself called the Great Wall of China No. 2. We pedaled along on our crooked, rusty bikes. The squeaking from the straining bolts on our handlebars and ancient tires made a sort of hypnotizing melody as we traveled away from our neighborhood towards our destination. Silva wasn't talking much, but I didn't blame him. The reason why we'd left my place so late was because his dad had beat him again. He had a shiner that was growing larger and darker by the second that pulsed around his right eye. He appeared at our door after running away from home for the night, struggling to hold back what I knew would be an eventual waterfall of tears as my mom hurriedly rushed him inside. He didn't like to cry in front of anyone else but me. When we were alone after something horrific went down at his place, I'd wrap my arms around his shoulders and pull him close as he let everything go. I hated it when he cried, to be honest. The brave and adventurous boy who I considered my best friend in the whole world was reduced to a frightful, self-hating infant whenever he bawled into my chest. It just wasn't right, you know? Not for someone like him. Silva sniffed as we passed a few more houses before turning left onto a bridge that hovered over the interstate. There was Old Man Roger's house, with that gigantic fence that made sure no one was ever peeking into his backyard. There was Mommy Thrice's tiny little house. We called her Thrice because it looked like she had 3 boobs whenever she wore a t-shirt. And then there was Jessica Alder's house, the prettiest in the whole neighborhood, just like her. I thought about asking Silva if he wanted to go knock on her window and invite her to join us, but he was riding with his head down at that point. It was just going to be me and him for the rest of the evening. It was getting ready to rain. I could always tell. The tip of my nose burned whenever an ample rain was on the way, and Silva made fun of me for it when we first met. He'd been the new kid at school for a week or so, and we were playing baseball against another class of 5th graders, standing out alone and bored in center field when my nose began to tingle and I looked up at the clear sky. I told Silva, who wanted nothing more for someone to hit a fly ball so that he could run and catch it and impress our teacher, Miss Hawthorne, that a rainstorm was coming. "Sure, pal," he said with a smirk as he wiped at his sweaty forehead. He was a pale boy for someone who spent so much time playing in the sun outside, with a wild garden of brown, spiky hair and almond-colored eyes that lit up at the slightest hint of action. "Next you're going to tell me it's because of that satellite you call a nose on your face." "I'm serious," I said with a shrug. Silva was taller than me by a few inches, but didn't have my clean-cut looks. My mom always made sure that my jet-black hair was combed neatly to the side with generous scoops of gel and that my clothes were always pressed and symmetrical. Even though I liked to be outside as much as Silva, I was truly in love with all things arithmetic. Silva hated schoolwork and told me later, after we'd become good friends, that he thought I was one of the biggest nerds he'd ever seen. "It's getting ready to rain," I said as we passed the end of the bridge and rode along on a sidewalk decorated in cracks and chalk drawings. There hadn't been a single vehicle on the interstate as we passed over on the bridge, and not a peep could be heard from anyone or anything as we continued to ride through the night. We were getting closer to the park, which was built right next to the edge of a sprawling wood that separated Derry from the Penobscot River. "What do you think about that?" I asked as we moved along. Silva kept his head low as we pedaled. He stared intensely at his handlebars. "I'm gonna kill my dad," he finally said as we pulled into a small field of grass that stretched before the park. Our tires were muffled as we steered through the grass to stop in front of a green jungle gym that reflected a few beams of moonlight back into the air. Silva took his time getting off his bike as he sniffed again and wiped at his nose. He squeezed it, leaned over and blew onto the grass before he nudged his kickstand out and stepped away to look up at the moon. "What?" I asked warily. Silva, when everything was going right, was a confident, hopeful adventurer, not a hateful, promising murderer. I got off my own bike and walked over to stand next to him. His face was tense, the kind of tense that a person gets when they're mulling over a bad memory, and I placed a hand on his shoulder as I frowned worryingly and tried to look into his eyes. He wouldn't oblige and kept right on looking up at the moon. "What'd you just say?" "I said that I'm gonna kill that fat son of a bitch," he answered without a thought. He didn't blink as he bit down on his teeth and shook his head. I lied to your ma earlier, Jerry. I wasn't the only one he hit tonight." "What do you mean?" "He punched my ma before he came to my room. Heard the impact clear as day. Must have smacked her right on the jaw because he knocked her out cold. I saw her laying motionless on the living room floor before I ran out of the house, with this blank look in her eyes." He closed his eyes and lowered his head as his jaw began to twitch. "Her hands were all curled up, like a dead spider's. The son of a bitch knocked her out cold, Jerry." He covered his face with his hands as he started to sink to the grass. But I held him up and led him forward, past the jungle gym, past a towering 4-seater swing set, and up a set of dotted stairs to stand on the Great Wall of China #2. He started to sob as I pulled him into me and held him gently. The fierce rocking of his shoulders and the growing wetness on the front of my shirt made me clench my own teeth as he purged his angst from his system. It was enough to make me want to kill his father, too. I was getting ready to slowly push him away when the sound of someone clearing their throat below us caught us both by surprise. We turned to peek over the bridge and widened our eyes at the sight of a pretty girl, not much older than us. She had flowing blonde hair that ran over one of her slim shoulders and a sucker in her mouth as she stared up at us curiously. The pant legs on her clean denim overalls hung over a pair of spotless blood-red sneakers. "Why are you two crying?" she asked as she pulled her sucker from out of her mouth with a loud pop. It was as red as her sneakers, and the slickness of her saliva as it fell away from the candy shone in the moonlight as she waved it around in front of her oval-shaped face. "And what are you doing out here so late?" She bent her head to the side and a sly smile crept onto her face. "Are you two queers?" she asked innocently. That's when Silva shoved me away and quickly wiped at his eyes. "No!" he practically yelled, and the girl giggled as she stuck the sucker back into her mouth. "I'm not no queer," Silva confirmed with disgust as he pointed at me with a thumb. "And I wasn't the one crying either," he continued, giving me a sideways look that said, "Just go along with this, buddy," as he glared at the girl. "It was my friend. He's having some problems at home, so we're just here blowing some steam. I'm only here for moral support anyway. Mostly." He narrowed his eyes as he looked her up and down. I knew in that moment that he was smitten with her. Silva always had a soft spot for a pretty face, so I just nodded my head and went along with it. It was the least I could do. After all, what are friends for in a time of need, right? The real question is, what are you doing here? Silva asked suspiciously. A girl like you shouldn't be roaming around at night. You run across some homeless pervert and it's game over for you. I can take care of myself, the girl snapped back, and I had to stifle a smile. It was obvious that she was feeling him too. I was never good with the ladies anyway, so I was more than happy to stand back and watch any romantic fireworks spark and ignite. It was exactly the kind of thing that Silva needed to get his mind off of his old man. So in a way, I was thankful that the girl showed up when she did. Although, Silva did have a point. It was weird seeing another kid out so late. It was well past midnight and most girls in Derry weren't the type to go exploring through the woods like we did. And what do you mean a girl like me? She asked Silva as she raised her chin at us. Are you trying to say I'm not tough enough to be out here like you? She stuck out a hip and frowned. Us girls are plenty tough. Tougher than boys sometimes. She sneered. At least we're not afraid to cry when other people are around. I wasn't crying, Silva growled as he grabbed onto the bridge. And besides, I didn't mean nothing by it. It's just that, well... He lowered his eyes and his voice went soft. You're pretty, and pretty girls are extra vulnerable when they're out all alone, you know? I raised an eyebrow as I leaned onto the bridge with Silva. The girl was blushing. She had to turn her head to the side to conceal one of her burning cheeks. That's all I meant, honest, Silva finished. The girl seemed to be thinking as she started to suck on her candy more aggressively, and finally, after looking the both of us over and allowing a smile to melt onto her face, she shook her head and sighed. Alrighty then, she said warmly. Then she extended her neck and raised both of her eyebrows expectantly. Well? She asked, to neither of us in particular. Aren't you gonna invite a lady up onto your bridge? Silva's face lit up at the suggestion, and quicker than you could pop a single popcorn kernel, he'd waved her up and she was standing at our side. She was shorter than I thought and smelled like beeswax. Which is a funny thing to say, I know, but that's exactly what it was. She smelled like she just stepped out of a tub full of beeswax. Silva didn't seem to mind. He was grinning from ear to ear as she settled herself by leaning back onto the bridge to get a look at both of us. Hey, I'm Jerry, I said as I extended a hand. The girl's face instantly dropped, as if she was worried about touching me, and then Silva, ever the friendly one, nudged her side with an elbow and nodded his head at me. Well, go on, shake his hand, he said. Don't be a weirdo. Uncertainty swirled deeply inside of the girl's eyes, which were dandelion yellow, which was weird as anything, as she looked down at my hand and tried to ease the sudden tension with a half-hearted smile. Then, after looking at both of us and giving a tentative nod, she weakly reached out and took my hand. Her skin was icy cold as I clasped my fingers around it, and I winced and sucked my teeth before I let her go. What the hell? I said. I didn't like to curse, but I was so surprised that I let it slip. You're freezing. Am not, the girl retorted. She popped her sucker back into her mouth and frowned. Anyway, I forgot my jacket at home and I'm cold. Yeah, me too, Silva thoughtlessly agreed. I gave him a mean look as I raised an eyebrow at the girl skeptically. Okay, I said, trying to rub a bit of warmth back into my hand. So what's your name? Penny, the girl answered. She smiled brightly as she spoke, erasing every bit of tension in the air as we became entranced by her beauty. She was a real looker when you got up close and she smiled. A real 10 out of 10. If she'd announced right then and there that she was going to rob us, we'd have had no chance. It was only too bad that she didn't rob us. I would have preferred that. Especially for Silva. After basking in the light of her smile for a few long seconds, Silva introduced himself and we all got to talking. I felt a few tiny drops of rain peck at the tips of my ears as we relaxed and got to know one another, and then more began to drop and evolve into an eventual drizzle that created a soft soundtrack for the rest of the evening. Penny claimed that she lived in a small town on the other side of the river, which was, once again, a bit weird, because I was sure that it was being rebuilt after a massive fire burnt it down months ago. But challenging her on that never crossed my mind, really. I was still lightheaded from the effect of her smile. Silva got along with her well, and I suppose that I was content that he was sporting such a jubilant attitude as we all laughed and cracked jokes well into the early morning. Penny's jokes were all morbid. They consisted of dead babies and children hanging themselves and parents going mad and butchering their families. And she had a cackling sort of laugh, but no matter how disturbing the subject matter, she managed to find a way to keep us laughing. Penny could, quite literally, do no wrong. We were instant friends. We must have been on that bridge for over an hour before Silva began to yawn and told Penny that it was just about time for us to go home. And she looked sad, but accepted the end of our get-together with another smile that made my heart race with excitement. Before we left, Silva announced that he had to go pee in the woods, and Penny was quick to say that she'd join him. Silva didn't refuse, and I only assumed that they'd end up saying goodbye by making out in the tree line before we rode back home. So I waved them away, watched them stroll away from the park and disappear into the tree line, and well, I waited patiently. I didn't mind being alone on the bridge as I tried to count how many raindrops coated my head and listened to the steady wind blow through the trees around me. I'd never seen a hobo there a day in my life, and I didn't have to worry about any nocturnal predators roaming through the area. It was as tame as could be given the time of the year, and so I tried to clear my mind and enjoy the moist weather as I continued to wait for the pair to return. I gave them plenty of time before I began to pace nervously along the bridge. I looked out in their direction, hoping for their silhouettes to appear in between the trees so I wouldn't have to go out into the dark and look for them. Even with the moon still out in the sky, it was easy to get lost in the dense Maine woodland surrounding Derry. And if I got lost, then it'd be a long time before the sun came back out again. I really didn't want to risk that. But something deep down in my gut told me that I needed to go out there and find my best friend. And so, after summoning up a good amount of courage and storing it into my clenched fists, I climbed down from the bridge and made my way towards the edge of the park, looking straight into the portion of the tree line where Silva and Penny had entered. I stood on my tiptoes and angled my neck to and fro, trying to peer into the darkness at odd angles, hoping that they'd suddenly appear, making my quest obsolete. But no such thing happened. I called out Silva's name and waited for a response. Nothing. Next I tried Penny's and waited a few seconds longer for her to answer back. But no one did. The only sound that greeted my ears, aside from the symphonic drizzling of the rain, was the hungry call of an owl perched somewhere high in the trees. I had no choice but to explore the woods. So I took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and slowly walked out into the darkness. It didn't take me long to reach Silva and Penny, maybe 10 minutes, give or take a few. But it was long enough for every sense on my body to rocket to superhuman levels as I navigated through the dark. The crunching of my feet against the leaves and sticks on the woodland floor made me nervous as I clawed through the, at times, oppressive vegetation. There were a few moments when I thought that the woods had come alive, that it was trying to wrap me in a cocoon of branches and stems and suck the life out of me, like some kind of mammoth carnivorous plant. And to be honest, I almost lost it. I almost turned right back around and sprinted out of those woods. I almost abandoned my friend out of an irrational fear. Not that that would have changed anything, unfortunately. Like I said, it didn't take me long to reach the two of them. A horrible slurping sound reached my ears just when I'd almost made the decision to book it back to the playground, and I fumbled through the brush until I came across a small circle of rotten tree trunks. I don't like to describe what I saw then, and most of the time I don't at all. I only did it then because the police insisted. Silva hadn't been the only one, they told me later. A few more children were murdered 1 week after his maiming, and they were afraid that more deaths were to come. Anything that they could use to ID the murderer was crucial to their case. So I told them then, and for the sake of history, I'll tell you now. Silva was laying motionless on a few of those tree trunks, and Penny was the one making those slurping noises as she bobbed her head up and down above his abdomen. At first, a shadow obscured what was really going on, and I assumed that Silva was getting a blowjob. But the sky parted just as I was about to call out and playfully yell for them to hurry it up, and covered in an ominous cylinder of moonlight, revealed Silva's terrified face to me. He was choking on a mouthful of blood as he gagged and weakly tried to claw at Penny's face as she continued to bob her head above his belly. And looking down, I gasped as I saw that his gut had been split open. Penny, who wore a manic smile on her blood-stained face, was stuffing it with his guts as she loudly slurped a portion of his intestines into her mouth. She snapped her head up and glared at me with her yellow eyes, which had suddenly began to glow in the darkness, and giggled disturbingly with a voice that was completely absent the young girl who I'd come to know on that rope bridge only minutes ago. "Hey there!" she, or it, whispered through the woods. I focused my eyes on its face and was stunned to see that half of Penny's visage had melted away, revealing one half of a grinning clown's. A glossy red nose, rounder than any nose I'd ever seen, had exploded from out of the side of one of Penny's nostrils, and a wide, tall white forehead roamed up into half of her hairline. 2 permanent red streaks, darker and more embedded into its face than the blood that coated it, fell down onto its plump cheeks from underneath its glowing eyes, and a slithering tongue flicked out from behind an abrupt row of jagged teeth that chomped at the empty air as the thing slowly leaned forward over Silva's struggling body. "Hey there, Jerry," it repeated. One of its eyes sunk down into its face, causing its glow to radiate just underneath the skin above one of its white cheeks. Silva painfully turned his head to stare at me, and harshly coughed up blood as the thing suddenly tore through his chest with a hand and ripped out his heart through his ribs. The crunching sound of his bones splintering made me almost puke. His heart was still beating faintly as the clown held it out for me and squeezed. Blood ran over its twitching fingers to fall onto the ground below.
"I might have some trouble finishing this,"
it said.
"You want to join me?"
"It's delicious. I promise."
I don't even remember taking one last look at Silva before I spun around and ran. What's most vivid to me still are the sounds of that thing, that clown, whatever it was, crashing through the woods behind me as I sprinted back to the playground. I could swear that I felt its hands clawing my back as I prayed to God that I didn't trip over a branch or slam into a tree. Once I had miraculously broken the tree line, I didn't look over my shoulder once as I dashed to my bike and pedaled with all of my might back to the interstate. The sight of a few cars driving along the highway below gave me a bit of courage, however, and it was then that I slowed to a stop, took a few moments to catch my breath, and turned around. I learned then that it was a clown. Tall and slightly skinny, although its garb was full of air and could have hidden its true body type. It stood alone, just on the other end of the interstate and with its hands behind its back. It brought one of its pale hands out and blew me a kiss as I begged for my legs to move again if it started to sprint towards me. And then the other hand appeared, and it was clutching the hair on Silva's decapitated head. It was still dripping blood from its neck, and Silva's jaw hung loosely in the air as the thing covered its mouth apologetically and bent over and laughed. I'll never forget what it said to me as I turned around and pedaled with everything I had back home. "I'll see you soon, Jerry. Very, very soon." It told me that as if it was going to... It told me that it was going to see me again. Do you know how hard it is to live with that? To go to bed with those sights and sounds in your head? With that threat always present in the back of your mind? Do you? No. You don't, do you? I'll always be alone in that way. Until the day I die, I guess. I'll finish with this. I don't sleep anymore without pills. Wrap your head around that. And I thank God every day and every night that thing never came for me like it said it would. And that hopefully it never will.